صباح الخير الجميع وأهلا وسهلا فيكم ب Psychic Militancy. I'm Lara and I'm so excited to have Amy Greer with me today. This is our first recording actually. So she will be joining us today. Amy, can you just introduce yourself? I mean, so many folks that are going to be watching this know the infamous video of Mahmoud Khalil being kidnapped by ICE agents. And in that video, we hear him say, "Call Amy." And so folks know Amy without knowing Amy, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to introduce yourself and we'll go from there.
Sure. My name is Amy Greer. I'm an attorney at Dratel Lewis, which has been my job for the last 4 years or so. And I am primarily a criminal defense attorney, but also was serving as a disciplinary defense attorney with students at Columbia and Barnard. And that's how I came to know Mahmoud. So I am also one of Mahmoud's many attorneys at this point in time, serving on an incredible team of people for that incredible man, Mahmoud, and his incredible wife, Noor Abdallah. And yeah, I'm also a former librarian and a romance novel nerd and a proud dog human.
You're a full person.
I'm a whole person.
You're not just Mahmoud Khalil's lawyer.
Yes, right.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad to have you. You know, I just want to tell folks how you and I met. So, and this is kind of what started me thinking, you know, the podcast is meant to really take issues that we are seeing in real time and some of the things that I think that stick the most with people and get lodged inside of them. And we have a hard time kind of processing what's happening. So the entire idea about psychic militancy is how do we build up the stamina to process the issues that we are seeing, the violence, the scale of that, be able to sort of break it down structurally, understand it as part of a larger issue. And so certainly as we see these ICE raids happening and escalating, ICE taking over cities, we're seeing in Chicago, we're seeing in LA, Mahmoud, of course, and his case is central to that. I think a lot of people have that clip of him seared into their mind and can kind of use that as a way to look at and sort of track the escalations that have been happening. But back to how we met. So we met at ArabCon in Michigan, which is the Arab Convention, and the ADC, the Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, are the ones who kind of brought us together. And when you and I spoke, you talked about being able to sort of connect psychic militancy with embodied lawyering. And I'm wondering if you can say just a little bit about that before we move into more about how you got involved in Mahmoud's case and some of the more details around that, again, as a way to help people unpack and sort of connect the dots around this and how we remain attuned to the multiple variants of violence that are happening, and most importantly, how we can resist them.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I've really noticed, and, you know, if people can see me, I'm very clearly a white woman, just to state that positionality, which I think is really important. I think so much of my field and lawyering and librarianship, frankly, my former field, is a very cerebrally oriented field where you sort of operate from the neck up a lot of the time, where you're thinking a lot, you know, you're writing a lot, you're researching a lot. And so it's easier, I think, you know, not necessarily simpler, but easier to intellectualize everything that you're seeing, that you're grappling with, that you're researching, that you're arguing. And there's a tendency, I think, in that intellectualization to remain up there, even as we relate to each other in our field, to our clients, to the communities and the families from which our clients are situated, are from. And I think that can actually be part of the violence when we forget the relational aspects of lawyering. And actually my eyes are filling a little bit even as I say those words, because I think it makes the job a lot harder, but also simpler in a way. So like I said, it's easier to go with the flow and like the pressure of just intellectualizing and remaining up in our brains all the time. But what we lose out on is that simple, beautiful relational aspect that can come with bearing witness and standing beside someone as they're going through some of the hardest moments of their life, and also being part of, or at least in communication with and in a relationship with those folks' families and their communities, as we understand how this person's struggle, relates to, as you said, to the broader picture, but also within my own body and my own lived experience of bearing witness. And I think sometimes what can happen is when you remain only up in your head also, and I do this, I catch myself doing this sometimes. You cut to the chase, you don't really acknowledge all the other stuff and whatever. And meanwhile, this person, particularly as a criminal defense attorney, but also in Mahmoud's case, and just to be clear, he's never been charged with a crime. I just mean situationally, the people that I'm walking beside a lot of the time, it is its own form of violence when I fail to recognize them as a whole person, and also assume that they don't want to understand myself in relation, right? That there's a give and a take to that. And so I'm not super articulate about it yet, because it still lives in my skin, I think, and I'm finding language as I am bringing awareness to it. But I don't want to be part of the violence. I want to be part of the relational facets of what's happening here. And I am of the community that's also being impacted as I care and reside in my own body, in my own community. So those are some of the things that I sit with and hold. And like I said, I'm working on finding language for, because I really just feel it.
Yes.
A lot of
Yeah.
the time.
Yeah. And I, to the contrary, I find it so important what you're saying. And, it's less about finding the words. One of the things that I talk a lot about when we talk about psychic militancy are the ways in which affect is asked to be vacated immediately. And you're bringing us squarely into that. We rarely get to hear the relational element of lawyering, so to speak. I mean, it's a stereotype, right? It's like I'm by the book, all these sorts of things. And then here we are in the midst of these violent acts that themselves are criminal. And, I don't want to get into the legalities of it because the entire thing is, but what you're saying basically is that this is a political project. And here I'm sort of thinking about Frantz Fanon. I can't but think of that. I often think about Frantz Fanon. But, in the beginning of sort of Black Skin, White Mass, he immediately, I think in like the second sentence, he says, I'm not even going to pretend that this is objective, because it can't be objective, right? I'm a Black man. It's not objective. And in many ways, you're bringing us into that. And for me, when I hear you talk about that, I'm thinking part of the ways to remain psychically militant, and particularly in professions like yours, is number one, recognize that there is no profession that exists outside of that even when it is sold to us, or we are disciplined into this, whether it's my profession as a psychologist or you as a lawyer, that says somehow you can make that separation. And worse than that, they sell it as though that's what makes us good. That's what makes us competent. Being able to hear from afar will allow us not to be biased, all these sorts of things. And here you are sort of bringing us immediately into the potential violence when we're missing the texture, the relational texture, the affect that's involved in that. And that actually is the political project. If we're working on cases like you're working, when with Mahmoud's case, it is about him. I don't want to delete that he's the one who had to endure the violence of the state and everything that came with that, and also the recognition that this is actually part of a larger political project of surveillance, of violence, of anti-migrant policies, of xenophobia, of white supremacy. I mean, all the layers. And I think you saying, let's try to work away from this severed head and body, and the fact that it's the affect that alerts you to that is really powerful for me. Actually, I watched you on Real News Network, and you had this beautiful and such a moving moment where you said, in between the time when he called you and Noor called you back, you had this moment where you broke down and you cried. And then you said, like I had to pull it together. And I'm wondering if we can talk about that a little bit as like a moment signaling to you, like there's something here I need to feel, and that actually will help me and guide me in the way that I'm approaching this. But I want to hear a little bit more from you. I just found that so moving as a way to remind us, like actually being grounded in that is what's helpful.
Yeah. And I will say, I will answer that in a second, but I will also say that I frequently weep while I'm writing legal briefs. So when I'm writing sentencing memos where a client's going to be sentenced, or I'm writing a compassionate release motion for a client, where we're trying to get a sentence modification, you know, to have their sentence, lowered. And you read, like, you know, having interviewed the client and interviewed their families and understood what they've survived, and how incredibly resilient they've had to be in the face of such violence, and disinvestment. Many of our clients, of course, are Black and Brown from heavily disinvested in and heavily surveilled communities, and you know, in some cases, colonized communities where they've left, say, El Salvador and come here and found this, you know, a different flavor, but the same kind of violence and surveillance. And so my colleagues joke that I leak while I write, because I find that, you know, it's really, I'm writing about a human being, and I'm writing about a human being whose life has inherent value because they exist, right? That's all it. They don't need to be in relation to anybody to have value. They just have value. And then on top of that, that they're also somebody who's loved by others and are part of a community. And so, so that has been my practice. And, as a public defender, I also found that if I met people's anger with saying, you know, I have boundaries and like, you can't talk to me like that, as opposed to staying in my body and saying, I'm seeing that you're really angry right now, you know, and I'm feeling that, like, what do we need to address right now? Or what, you know, how can we, and trying, so all of that has come with me into the moment that I got that call from Mahmoud, where he, called me and said he's surrounded by ICE agents. And, you know, I, you know, try to keep calm, and because I didn't want to scare Mahmoud. And, you know, so I had to kind of do the stuffing in the moment to just kind of stay present to him. And I did talk to the ICE agent, actually, that was effectuating the arrest. And then he hung up on me. The ICE agent did. And in that moment, I felt profoundly helpless.
You're going to be under arrest. So turn around.
Okay, let's not. Okay, he's not resisting. He's giving me his phone, okay? He's not, I understand. He's not resisting. Like,
there's no need for this. Don't worry about it. You're going to have to come with us. Don't worry about it. I'm coming with you. Don't worry. No one's resisting. No one's getting worked up.
you guys really don't need to be doing all of that.
It's fine. It's fine.
حبيبي كيف بدي اتصل فيك؟
Take Amy. Call Amy.
Okay. Hi Amy. Yeah, they just like handcuffed him and took him. I don't know what to do. Okay. And what should I do? I don't know. Noor. Let me ask. Can we get a name, please? Can we get your name? I understand the lawyer is asking for your name.
Over there. We don't give our names.
The lawyer's asking for your name. He's saying they don't give their names.
Oh yeah, that's right. They'll be taken to immigration custody at 26 Federal Plaza.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
They'll be taken to immigration custody at 26 Federal Plaza.
She said they're taking him to 26 Federal Plaza. Can you please specify what agency is taking him, please? Excuse me. They're not talking to me. I don't know. I looked, oh, excuse me, the lawyer would like to speak to somebody.
And I knew that Noor was watching this and probably also felt, terrified and helpless and not really sure what to do. And so, yes, when the agent hung up on me, I cried. I felt helpless. I felt, I had such sympathy, or I guess it can't be empathy because I've never been in that situation before, but a compassion for what it must be like. And knowing where, Noor and Mahmoud especially has come from, from the Syrian regime as well, and how terrified he must be that he's being taken and he didn't know where, and how that might live in his body. Like all of those things were, in my mind at that moment, or in my body at the moment. And I cried, and I needed to cry in order to come back. Like, I could either go into an anxiety spiral upwards, or I could cry and ground for a moment. And then, I was sitting actually right here. I'm at the desk, and I literally laid my head down on the desk and cried for 30 seconds or something, and just kind of, and then pulled myself back in, all my pieces back in. Okay, what do I need to do? But yeah, I mean, it just was a swirl of, my own fear, my own sense of helplessness, my own sense of frustration and anger, but also, oh my God, Noor is there. She's 8 months pregnant. Oh my God, is she okay? And where are they taking him? And he must be terrified. And, all of those things just start spilling out. And so, I had to ground.
Yeah, that makes so much. I mean, you're registering the magnitude of it, right? And I think this is the disciplining effect, which in another way we can think about it as carcerality, right? The carceral system that conscripts us into separating our work as being with people, right? I have had this experience myself when I'd worked in quote unquote juvenile justice detention centers, where from the second you come in, whether it's through going through, what's it called? Metal detectors and people warning you how violent people are. Everything is primed, both in terms of our schooling and the way we're taught how to do things. Everything is primed for us to receive a person as always already guilty, or what are the sort of protections we have to put on ourselves to be able to be present to them. And here you are, sort of, you call it grounding, right? Is fixing yourself in a place that doesn't, whether that's through tears or through, let me take a moment and breathe, let me remember and reconnect. And what I would say is tether yourself to the material reality of all the moving pieces, that yes, there is a human behind this, but also that this human is vulnerable to these larger structures that are actually created to maintain a particular social order. I think you'd said this at one point, that laws are made by people to protect power, property, and racial privilege. And as you describe this, I hear, the totality of that, like somebody who's connected to the larger pieces and not losing sight of that, despite the fact that it is a very harrowing moment, and one that I've heard you also talk about before, that it's not like this happens every day. This was not something that you were used to getting this phone call and saying, oh, I need to attend to this now.
And of course, he actually, on Friday night, Mahmoud called me at 8 p.m. on Friday night. And I was like, oh my God, are you okay? That's how I answered the phone. Tell me, are you okay? What's happening? And he was like, oh, it's fine. Sorry, Amy. And
I'm just saying hi. Not triggering a PTSD.
Yeah. And the other thing, Laura, that I personally wrestle with is the line between sharing with my clients and the people that I'm working with that I'm moved, that I'm human, that I'm whole, while also not decentering them and allowing my own emotional reactions to. And I think for me, sometimes that is when I tend to act, not purposefully, but go up into the cerebral. And I know I've definitely done this with Mahmoud and Noor sometimes, where I'm particularly as she was in the tail end of her pregnancy, and I'm talking with her about these very, like you said, material realities that I can only begin to imagine what she was experiencing, and not wanting to center my own rage that she has to go through that, or my own, sadness and frustration and sense of helplessness and even moral injury that I can't make it better, I can't fix it. And not from a savior perspective, but from a genuinely caring human to human, like, if I could make this better, I would be part of making this better or make it go away. And so, yes, there's also that holding, and you probably know this too from your own work as a practitioner, there's that remaining vulnerable and open and having a certain softness while not then decentering the person, who should be at the center of whatever's happening. And, it's been, I know you and I talked briefly, I've been doing my own work through a wonderful organization called Lumos Transforms, which teaches you some of these sort of micro tools and practices of grounding, of centering, of tethering. And there's these slight little dips back into your body so that you can, like little sips into your body so that you can remain there, but without getting, sort of overwhelmed by all the emotions and sensory experiences of being present to the horrors that are right in front of you, that I'm, professionally I'm bearing witness to, but also deeply personally bearing witness to. And how do I hold all of those things? I've had to seek help to do that.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that these forces are so intense. I think that's something that sometimes we miss, and we end up localizing the failure of ours individually. But the force of this conscriptive process, that severing, the splitting, whatever we want to call it, is really intense. So to be able to practice this is, a lot of what I've been working on are what are the ways in which we can commit to this as a daily practice, right? And that you can't leave it alone. And it's not something that you can do once and then not do it. But the other thing that I thought about as you were saying this is I found myself thinking, I've been thinking about this a lot, obviously, in preparation to sort of sit down and speak to you in more depth, is the ways in which you said, I felt so helpless, and I'm paraphrasing here what you just said, but I felt so helpless, and not from a savior perspective, but literally because I actually care, right? And I found myself wondering about how you have hit up through this case, and maybe through others, but perhaps this at a sort of heightened rate because of everything around it, right? That it's sort of all encompassing, about the limitations of law and what we've been seeing over the past 2 years around this. And I say that not just to go through the particularities, which I would love to do, about like what's different about this, what have we seen, the mechanics, because I think it's important for people to hear that part as well, especially from your perspective being so close to it, but also because my sense is for us to be able to do the things you're talking about to tether, to remain fixed on material reality while we're available to the people that we're working with or for, is that part of that also includes our own myth busting about, it's like sort of divesting from our own mythology around our practices, our professions, which to me is of course also tied in with myth busting around, systems of recourse for people, human rights, rights-based discourse, whatever the case is. But so I kind of wanted to go there, if you're okay with it, about like, as you think about this in totality, what are some of the myths you've hit up against? What are some of the limitations you've had to process? Because I can't imagine that that's not also part of it, part of what you're struggling through, working through, making meaning out of.
Yeah. No, yes, absolutely. And I always, I think it was Audre Lorde who said, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. So I'll just say first, I had another career before I became an attorney, and I'm even though initially I was frustrated that it took me a while to figure out my path in life and all of those kinds of things, I'm so grateful for the lived experience that I had prior to law school, because I went into law school with a very critical mindset. I knew, even going into law school, I was in my late 30s when I went into law school. And I knew when I went in that the law would never save us, and that it is not a tool for liberation. But what I also knew from living and working, I was living in Providence, Rhode Island, living and working in my community for at that time, 12 years, was it was also one of the primary tools of harm against the communities that I was living and working in. And I'm a good advocate. And, so I kind of, for my own self, I struggled with like the pros and the cons of engaging with the system that I saw as being harmful. But even as members of our community, and hopefully me as well, live in these, imaginal and liminal spaces to vision what's possible or what we could live, how we could live together differently. There's harm happening right now. And so I went in knowing that was holding all of these things. And then, as I always tell people, I sat in my property law class and I joked that I wanted to walk in dressed like I was a character in the Matrix, because when I took property law, I felt like I was seeing the beginning of such a powerful mechanism of social control, of the ways that, even early American law, basically where it was studying sort of indigenous perspectives on connection to land and connection to animals, connection to each other, connection to community, and how the law was specifically designed to be the opposite of that thing, so that it could be a tool for stripping and disconnecting and white supremacy, of course, yes. And so, that was also very illuminating in my first year of law school, to be like, okay, criminal law comes from property law. The Constitution was built while human beings were property, right, in the United States. And so all of these conceptualizations were very present. And also, there's a lot of pressure there to get good grades and be able to regurgitate all of this stuff back onto paper and all of that kind of stuff. And it was a fascinating sort of thing to hold that I continue to hold as a practitioner. And I think that, what struck me in law school, and I've been out for 5 years, so I'm a fairly new lawyer. What struck me about law school was how all of these big cases were decontextualized and ahistoricized, so the law is something that comes down, it's written down, and it's our job to uphold it or to fight for it or whatever. We didn't learn about the human beings behind these cases. There's a famous Supreme Court case called Iqbal v. Ashcroft, which changed the pleading standards in civil suits. And, you may know this from your work, but Iqbal was an Arab Muslim man in the United States who had been rounded up with over 200 other men and held, without charge. Their families didn't know where they were. And he was trying to sue the government for his civil, to vindicate the violations of his civil and constitutional rights. And instead, the Supreme Court changed the pleading standards to make it harder to bring suit. But that class is taught in civil procedure, right? Like a regular class that every law student takes without I happened to look at the date. And I was like, well, wait a second, this was 2003, what? And I went and read the whole case instead of the snippet that was in our casebook. Our professor was going to teach that case without any grounding in post 9/11 America, without any grounding of who those plaintiffs were and what rights they were seeking to vindicate. And so all of this is just to say that even as a law student, I very quickly understood, even more than I did even going into law school, the limitations of the law. And the last thing that I'll say, and we can dig into more of these pieces that I find, or the second to last thing I'll say, because I'll bring it back to Mahmoud in a moment, but it's something that really struck me a couple of years ago. So I also have worked on death penalty cases. I've worked in capital habeas cases where people have been already tried and convicted, and they're on in-state death rows. So in Texas and Florida is where I worked. And then our firm also handles death penalty trial cases, so at the front end of the cases. And we were writing a brief to ask the government not to death authorize a case, meaning that they would seek the death penalty. And one of the headings in that legal brief was client's life has value. Like, a legal brief has to have a heading. Okay. And I will just say here, and I hope I don't get in trouble, but whatever, it's fine. I will just say,
welcome to psychic militancy.
Yeah. I think that summarizes the law.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the failures of, or the successes of it. I mean, depending on whose perspective that you're looking at.
That's right.
The fact that you have to actually say aloud in spaces as a public defender, as a defender of people charged with crimes where they're facing the death penalty, and even as a defender of somebody like Mahmoud, who's never been accused of a crime, let alone charged or convicted of a crime, that this life matters and has value, not because of them in relation to anybody else, but because all lives contain, each of us contain multitudes, we contain universes, we are whole beings, and that is precious. In the law, you actually have to start by saying that.
By proving that.
By proving that. And so in law school, I had this conversation with deans and professors all the time. You want to have academic freedom to have political conversations, and that's great. We should have political debate and dialogue, but you are mistaking political freedom and conversation for what are actually survivalist conversations, because you are forcing people to justify their right to exist as they are. Before they can get to a political place. And I'm not saying that those are necessarily mutually exclusive things, everything is political and whatever, but there's a visceral reaction, as you well know, all of that everybody has, fight or flight, the amygdala file, where you're in survival mode, where you're like, oh, this person doesn't acknowledge my right to exist, not just to be here in this space, you and me right in front of each other, but actually like my right to exist as I am, as I'm constructed, as I've been beautifully made, all of these things. And so that person is not having a political debate. They are feeling in their bodies that they are fighting for their survival. And those are not the same types of conversations, as you well know. And
it's a setup.
To us And what happens to us physiologically, you leave your executive function, because you are fighting for your life in that moment. And that is the law. I mean, and that is something that I, as a public defender, I only made it, less than a year, because I felt like my presence in the room made it constitutional to harm. And I'm not saying public defenders I love public defenders. They are so critical and essential. But that goes back to your statement earlier, where I carried all this shame that I can't hack it. I can't, but the system isn't made for me to be a successful attorney and a successful advocate. It's not made for my clients to live a surveillance-free life, to be able to thrive and to be well. And so all of these pieces, intersect and come together around cases like Mahmoud's, where people felt very free, sending death threats. People feel very free to say, get him out of here. I mean, you saw the incredibly dehumanizing posts from the president, Shalom Mahmoud, and all of these kinds of things. And I think that the revelation for me as somebody who's been working on death penalty cases, the through line to Mahmoud's case is we live in a society that doesn't value life. And so so much of this is a survivalist conversation, including for those of us advocates. And we may not know, like in my white body, I may not have understood at first why I was having these incredibly visceral responses, but I'm understanding that I'm standing next to a human and feeling the energy rolling off of them, that they are fighting for their life. In some cases with my death penalty clients, literally fighting for their lives. And in the cases of like Mahmoud and Noor, fighting for their ability to thrive, be well, live without this surveillance mechanism on top of them. And all of that is at play in the law. So I don't think it's been a disillusionment for me as much as an illumination and clarifying of things. So like, I'm able to articulate things that maybe I couldn't before, even though they were rolling around in here in my inside of me previously. And I've been able to see the very intentional ways that they're activated and when they're deployed and against whom and why, which is again something I came in knowing intuitively, I think, but didn't fully grasp.
Right. Yeah. I really appreciate that, because I think sometimes we get stuck, especially when we're already oriented towards that sort of worldview, right? That sometimes we get stuck thinking these are platitudes. Like, I already know this, but you know, I should know that this is the way the structure works. We know that the law is not for liberation, just like I know psychology has always been a disciplinary tactic and used to construct psychological operations and fuck with people all around. I mean, we know all of this, but I think one of the things you're really honing in on that's so important that I often repeat to folks, and repetition is a part of it, because if there's a repetitive force of violence, it's violence that repeats itself. Our counter force has to be repetitive as well, is that there is no platitudes in the face of a system that has a monopoly on violence, is constructed in a particular way, stabilizes a particular social order, and us thinking that can be different, that there's any version of this that could be different, is actually one of the ways I think that we get caught up and get confused. And then we're fighting on the back foot, just like the parallel you're saying of these folks having to prove their humanity on the front end is an inversion, actually, about where this should start. But I think naming this, acknowledging this up front is the most important departure point. And I think sometimes folks feel like, well, but that's a given. But I think the way these systems work psychologically by lodging themselves inside of us is to make us actually forget that. So the parameters along which we are fighting both out externally, Dylan Rodriguez calls this lexical warfare, all the gymnastics we do in terms of language, also what we're fighting internally. So that departure point being like, no, this is our starting point here, is that this is the way it's constructed. People have to take an a priori position as non-human and then argue for their rights, not the other way around, which is the way that it's sold, particularly American empire and jingoism. Like, I was born and raised in Lebanon, and I carried with me that the quote unquote American judicial system is the best thing in the world. Like, where the fuck does that come from? Why would I ever carry that inside of it? It tells you the reach of empire, these myths that come to live inside of us and propagate around the world as part of an imperial project, right? And an accumulation and all those sorts of things. So I think repeating it is really important. The other piece that you said that I just want to say is that sometimes removing ourselves from these systems actually is a way to disrupt them stabilizing. So there's some incredible critical social workers that actually argue that our presence in these detention centers, ICE detention centers, is a fig leaf for the detention centers themselves, rather than us actually fighting and demanding that they not exist to begin with. Like, you don't go work in black sites, right? As psychologists did, by the way, and then pretend that was to safeguard the people being tortured. You are witnessing torture. That should be this. The starting point should be, this shit should not exist. Detention centers should not exist. Black sites should not exist. That's our starting point. And so withholding our labor, our presence, which actually provides cover and legitimacy, even unwittingly, you can think about that you're helping, But I suppose also I'm making an abolitionist argument, which seems to be also part of what you're attending to when you say humanity is a sort of our guide, and not in a liberal way. That not hearing that in a liberal way. It's in a way of actually what is demanded of us to dismantle this current violent system, and not just imagine, but enact and bring into being a world in which these sorts of setups, then I call it a setup, it's an impossible situation for those who are already fixed in place as criminalized, as certainly as we're seeing with all the ICE raids right now, and in Mahmoud's case too.
Yeah, no, I mean, gosh, you're getting to the heart of so much. Something that I personally struggle with, and I've had this conversation with some wonderful, thoughtful friends of peers of mine in the field, is exactly what you just described. Is, as public defenders and now, working on Mahmoud's case and even the disciplinary cases. Okay, so like, are we creating more harm by using our skills to defend folks who are being swept into this system intentionally, purposefully? Swept is probably even too mild of a word. Targeted. But this is what I sit with. This literally, welcome to my brain is, but is there a chance to mitigate that harm in any way? Sometimes there is. And so while we work toward abolition collectively, do we engage with the systems that exist now at all to do any kind of harm mitigation or not? And there are really, really valid perspectives that say you're not actually mitigating any harm. You're legitimizing the harm in some ways, and also the harm is still happening all the time. So we should focus all of our energies, creating these other systems and structures that are life nourishing, intended for people to thrive and to be well. And yeah, I mean, I go back and forth on any, like, literally from day to day, moment to moment. I'll be sitting in one place, like, F it, I'm just gonna go work with the people who are imagining something different and better. And then other times, like, in the meantime, what about my incarcerated clients, where I'm one of the few voices that they get to talk to every day or regularly, who are, making sure that they know they're not forgotten, that, because the other reality that's really challenging to everything that you just said is, like, there's a number of clients that I've had over the years that, because of the incredible cruelty of the system, not only have they been uprooted entirely from their own communities and then incarcerated caged in spaces that are not accessible to their communities, then their phone calls and their emails, et cetera, cost money that their communities and their families don't have. The list goes on. And so then, in some cases, myself and my colleagues are the voices that they get to hear for free, that they get to, connect with. And so I hear you. It is a true conundrum that these structures and systems, I think, have created, a Gordian knot, if you will, of, if I keep going into these spaces, I'm pulling tighter and making it harder for those who are trying to create something different over here. But I actually think, I think that something that can be done better collectively, just as electoral politics won't save us, but we still want good people to get elected into the offices of the systems that we do have. But then we tend to abandon them once they get there. The conversations stop, the accountability stops, and then we just mad again. Is opportunities to remain in conversation with each other. And something that I've thought a lot about is, like, how do I remain in better conversation? And by better, fuller, richer conversation with I am an abolitionist in my heart and in my spirit. Like that's the ultimate. I want to be unemployed, or employed differently.
Same here.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but how do I remain in better conversation so that my actions aren't pulling negatively on that work? And the other thing that I'll just say about your point about empire and this construct of rule of law that I've had such interesting conversations about is, and I'm feeling awful because there's a theorist who wrote about the ethic of care, I think she's like has a psychoanalytic background, but wrote about an ethic of care versus like fairness. And like holding all of those kinds of things. And like the law says that it wants to be objective and neutral, which we both know is a fallacy. And also that there's some kind of fairness that can be, like I'm going to treat all people the same, but in fact, all people aren't the same. And such doing is actually very harmful, as opposed to approaching things from the ethic of care. And the ways in which all of these systems and structures come together, like, where they're weaponized against people's identities, their communities, uprooting people and separating people from each other. I mean, it's the ultimate divide and conquer strategy that is so prevalent in empire, but being enacted here at home in ways that create such fractures that sometimes attorneys are oddly the people who's standing in those fractures.
Yes. Yeah.
And not well necessarily. I'm not saying but and also sometimes, it's the prison guards and the therapists and other people that are standing in those fractures. But I'm not sure we're doing a good enough job of weaving everything back to, pulling. So I don't know. I'm not being very.
I mean, we all become prison guards. We all become cops in the end. Engaged in this. No, I appreciate the conflict, and I think the conflict is because constitutively, it's an impossible choice, right? We're pulled into these impossible choices all the time. As you're sort of talking about this, I wonder if we can pivot into specificities around Mahmoud's case, just to sort of flesh this out a little bit more, because I feel like his case, what happened, what sort of unfolded really outlines for me and also crystallizes in so many ways the things that you're saying. Like, how do I not get involved with somebody who's just being kidnapped? And by the way, Amy, really small cases you got in your first 5 years, right? Both like these disciplinary charges in Colombia, and then Mahmoud Khalil. So you just hit the ground running. But maybe it was in your body from the beginning. Like you just needed to take on something like this that feels so sustaining to you. But maybe we can sort of look at that and I'd love to hear your thoughts, as you sort of walk through the mechanics of some of the things that have happened, certainly where we're at right now. The fight's not over. We understand that. And then maybe we can sort of also follow up with some of your thoughts about how that opened up the way for the raids that we're seeing, the intensified raids and kidnaps of migrants across the context of the settler colony.
Sure. So I think something that's really important to Mahmoud is to always start at Colombia first, and what that was before even before Trump was elected. So this is not unique to the Trump administration. So at Columbia after October 7th, students, particularly Palestinian students, Palestinian American students, Arab and Muslim students, first generation students, students of color, indigenous students, gathered together and rejuvenated some student groups that had been dormant for a number of years because they had tried previously to work toward divestment and pushed Colombia toward that. But they had been crushed pretty brutally previously also and just kind of brushed aside. So in 2023, in that fall, the organizing and it came together and intensified coalitions were built. And, many of your people who are going to listen to this incredible podcast that I'm very excited about, will know that the students began trying to engage in conversation with the administration. They had small vigils. They were trying to change how Colombia engaged on this issue. And for the Palestinian students, trying to even get Colombia to acknowledge that Palestinians were being brutally assassinated and murdered in their homes, whole families, decimated with these bombs. The incredible poet and scholar Rafat El-Riyr, assassinated in his home because he was such a powerful advocate for life, for Palestinian life. And students were doing all of this organizing, which then led to the encampments in the spring of 2024, and then the occupation of Hamilton Hall shortly thereafter. And the reason I say all of that is just because universities have often been sites of surveillance in times past, and the organizing that started happening at Columbia drew the attention of the federal law enforcement mechanisms, federal surveillance mechanisms. Under Biden, you had members of Congress coming to participate in the encampments, and you had members of Congress coming to campus to talk about, anti-Semitism and how brutally violent these encampments were, even though people were literally sitting there playing music and praying together and, feeding each other and making sure they were warm and clothed, etc. And so all of this is just to say that the whole surveillance systems from the Department of Education, the Department of Justice, law enforcement branches, all of those eyes turned to Colombia. And there was incredible coercive power initially from Congress, particularly the House Committee on Education and Workforce, hauling presidents in front of them, humiliating them, naming students, putting out that report on October 31st, 2024, and all of that. So Mahmoud, as a Palestinian Muslim man, on the Columbia campus, who refused to be silenced, who was speaking so eloquently about Palestinian dignity, Palestinian life, and doing an incredible job with political education work and all of that kind of stuff, and he never wore a mask. He never wore the kafia, wrapped around where you can't see the face. He was full-faced, full-throated, full-hearted, on cameras, and he was effective. Mm-hmm. He was one of the most effective communicators with the administration, with the media. He was on Wolf Blitzer. He managed and handled Wolf Blitzer, all of these kinds of things. So Mahmoud, with his diplomacy background and his incredible ability to connect, he's soft-spoken. He has this, he's very clear, but very gentle and soft-spoken in how he communicates. So he became sort of the face of a lot of the activity at Columbia. And this is important because over the fall of 2024 into the winter of 2024, and when Trump got elected, I think it caused a lot of these third-party Zionist entities to feel like they could, I almost picture, not to be trite about it, but I almost picture in a hockey match when they throw their gloves off and just start going, I feel like that's literally, they were all boom, boom, no gloves. Here we go.
These AstroTurf organizations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So then they started, they had been doxing for a while. The doxing wasn't new before Trump was elected. But I think once Trump was elected, there was a freedom of the doxing that happened and a free for all. And Mahmoud was heavily targeted. And he was named online. His face was out there. Lies were told about him and what he stood for. And moving after the inauguration, and Marco Rubio is now Secretary of State. Kristi Noem is now the head of the Department of Homeland Security. Then what happened is the doxers would name Mahmoud and tag.
Yep.
DHS, the Secretary of State, and whatever. And so I had the chance to talk to the incredible House Un-American Activities Committee and McCarthyism scholar, Ellen Schrecker. And she said that government, I'm going to butcher how she said it because it was very eloquent, but basically this kind of government suppression is not possible without third-party cooperation and collaboration. And this is exactly what came to bear on Mahmoud, is you
like
had
vigilante justice.
the vigilante justice, and then the taking up of that by Marco Rubio to say, you know, okay, we're going to target this guy. And I think this is important because these silencing mechanisms have been so powerful and critical for people who would otherwise exercise their voice. I can't tell you how many American citizens I've heard from, naturalized and, you know, native-born American citizens, who are afraid to speak because of these the many mechanisms of private surveillance, public surveillance, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And then Mahmoud was taken. And I just say all of that because
this was March 8th, right? 2025.
March 8th, 8:26 p.m. I think it's because all the people who saw that video, well, I shouldn't say all the people, many of the people who saw that that abduction video, that arrest video, were already steeped in all of these layers of surveillance, or at least aware of it. The zeitgeist, you know, like the energy of the space. People,
which is the point.
Knew. Exactly.
Yep.
And that's why I always start there.
Yes.
A lot of people always push me to start at 8:26 p.m. on March 8th. And it's like, yes, but that arrest would not have been, and not that I'm giving credit to any of these people, but would not have been as terrifying for people had they not just watched the prior 18 months.
Absolutely. The infrastructure. The infrastructure. But it also just says, and I want to get back to you right away, but it also, you're modeling for us in real time what you were saying before, that the pull is to decontextualize and ahistoricize. And here you're like, no, we have to back up and start with the infrastructure that's built, which includes the Biden administration, who's the first, that was the administration that floated material support for terrorism, by the way. That was the administration that then handed over a turnkey fascist state and the infrastructure leading up to that.
And Marco Rubio, as a senator, was talking about using the same statutory mechanisms that he ended up using as Secretary of State. He tried to get the Senate to pass bills in that regard beforehand, and then he was tapped by Trump and became Secretary of State. So he was also at work in Congress already laying the groundwork. And of course, the House committee was doing its job, you know, gathering all these student records. And we didn't even talk about that part of it. Universities turned over 100,000 student and faculty records to Congress because they spoke out for Palestinian life and dignity.
Cowards.
And so like, and all of this happened before Mahmoud was abducted. And I will also just say, like, we were already drafting the complaint, which is the First Amendment lawsuit that we can talk about if you want, but like, we were already drafting that complaint in January of 2025, you know, 3 months before Mahmoud was taken, because we saw that all these records were getting turned over. Congress had come back to ask Columbia for more records. And, you know, they did all this fact gathering in the name of legislation, which I can't believe that that those records have not then been turned over to the Department of Education, you know, the agencies that make up the task force for anti-Semitism, the federal agencies like DOJ, Department of Education, Department of Health and Human Services. So then Mahmoud calls, you know, and prior to him even calling me at 8:26 p.m. on March 8th, you know, he had already expressed to Columbia fear regarding the doxing that was happening and the tagging of him to ICE, and that they had sent his address to ICE and that ICE knew where he lived and like all of this kind of stuff. And we now know, you know, after the fact, from the American Association of University Professors versus Rubio case out of the District of Massachusetts, we now know that that Mahmoud had, in fact, that we suspect that those texts and the tweets and the Canary mission profiles were the bases, and to an extent Beitar as well, were the bases for some of these targeting by the Department of State and by the Department of Homeland Security. And we know that now, but we had already suspected that long ago, because when they came to get Mahmoud, they said that his student visa had been revoked, and he's a lawful permanent resident, or a green card holder, as some people might be more familiar with that term. And so we were perplexed, because we were like, how is it that these people don't even know what status he holds, right? Like, and we now know that it's because it came through the Department of State and these profiles, you know, the Canary.
And you in fact said that, right, on the phone. You were like,
yes, when the agent took the phone from Mahmoud, I said, you know, well, at first I asked for a warrant, of course, because, you know, there needs to be a warrant for an arrest of this kind. And he kept saying that he had a warrant, but I never saw it. Mahmoud didn't see it, nor didn't see it. But also he said that, you know, they're taking him because Mahmoud's student visa had been revoked. And I said to him, you know, but he's a green card holder. You can't revoke a green card without due process, and he'll be brought in front of a judge and whatever. And I was like, correct. And because he'll be brought in front of a judge, his green card hasn't been revoked. Like, you can't do that. It's literally not a thing. You can't, you know. And so I started demanding a warrant and getting a little feisty, and that's when he hung up on me. But
what did they say when you said he's a green card holder? Because this part is wild for me too.
Yes,
they just don't give a fuck.
He said, well, they revoked that too. That's what he said to me. And we also know from Noor, you know, from Noor's experience that and Mahmoud's experience, that they said when they told the agents that Mahmoud was a green card, they started making phone calls, and like Noor went up to the apartment to get the green card and you know, to show it, but somebody told them over the telephone, take him anyway.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I think they didn't know, at least these agents and the agents that effectuated this arrest, or at least the one that I spoke to, the Department of DHS that he works for, typically works on trafficking cases, both drug and human. And like, this was not his typical beat, so to speak. And so, you know, I think for him, like, he didn't know, it didn't matter to him one way or the other, but it was also interesting that DHS sent, you know, these basically law enforcement guys out, as opposed to sort of what would be a more traditional ICE agent, so to speak.
It shows us the orders. That's right. But where the orders were coming from, and it was a direct order. It didn't fucking matter what they did or what the facts were. This was meant to do what it was meant to do.
Right. And what we know from the AAUP case now is that what we know from that case now is that the executive branch formed what's called a tiger team. And I don't know all the nuances of that in the way that some of my colleagues from that case do. But basically it was like a strike force, like a reaction, you know, to take urgent action from multiple high-level members of the executive branch who were in collaboration on identifying these students. And we know that the first one, Mahmoud was the first one, Rumeysa Ozturk, also the student from Tufts University, who was so horrifyingly kidnapped off the street while speaking to her mother on the telephone. And so similar to Noor, like, being present to this, when I heard Rumeysa testifying at her bail hearing that she had been on the phone with her mother, I had the same, you know, I cry at everything. You'll hear me say that all, but because I just thought, oh my gosh, I'm not a mother myself, but I cannot begin to fathom the fear and terror when you hear your daughter screaming through the telephone, when masked men are approaching. Anyway, so with Mahmoud, he was taken, and that night, Friday, March 8th, they told us they were taking him down to Federal Plaza, 26 Federal Plaza. And Noor, who is she should not have to be the incredible, courageous, and brave person that she is in the face of all of this. And yet she managed to tap into some well of strength and grace that I can't even process. She had the wherewithal to be asking the agents questions. Who are you? What agency are you from? Where are you taking him? She got license plates, etc. So we knew where they were taking him. And then I had to jump into action because like we've already established, I'm a criminal defense attorney. I'm not an immigration attorney. And immigration, for your listeners who may not know, there are Article 3 constitutional courts. Those are the ones you typically think of, where all these cases challenging Trump, those cases are going through. Mahmoud's habeas case is going through that. It's the U.S. federal district courts, the U.S. appellate courts of appeal, the U.S. Supreme Court. Those are all examples of Article 3. Your states have variants of those same things. Those are all examples of Article 3 courts. But immigration court, we use immigration judge, we say immigration court. They are not judges, and these are not courts. These are administrative proceedings that happen. The immigration judges are at-will employees of the Attorney General of the United States of America. So the same branch, the same person who oversees the Department of Homeland Security and ICE, who is effectuating these arrests and caging of people, that same employer also employs immigration administrators that we call immigration judges. And these courts are not authorized to ask or deal with constitutional questions. They say that they are, but they're not. They can really only determine if there's a legitimate, if the government has, like, I'm going to say this very simply so I don't get stuck in legalese. So lawyers listening, I know I'm being imprecise, but I'm just trying to clarify. Like, basically what they can do is they can determine if there is a valid basis, the government has a valid basis to remove a person from the United States and then effectuate that removal, right? To like deport. That's really what they do. And so I work in an Article 3 constitutional setting, most of the court setting. I'm not an immigration attorney, and that's a whole other beast and a whole other world. So because of my discipline defense work, I am so grateful that I knew I had worked on a case with an immigration habeas attorney. And I called her at 9:00 on a Saturday night, and she answered my call. And her name is Kyle Barron, and she's incredible. And she stayed up with me that entire night to write that first habeas petition. And habeas means of the body. And basically what it does is challenge the constitutionality of the holding of the body, the detention of a person. So we wanted to file a petition challenging the constitutionality of Mahmoud's arrest and detention. That's what we were doing. So we stayed up all night and filed that. So now what's happening is Mahmoud is facing, well, we can talk about his other cases, but focusing on immigration, he's fighting a two-headed monster at the moment. So we have our federal habeas case in federal district court, and he has an immigration case in those administrative proceedings that I just mentioned. And we're fighting both simultaneously. So what's happening at this exact moment is some of my incredible colleagues at the New York Civil Liberties Union and at the ACLU National argued in the Third Circuit, which is a federal court of appeals in Philadelphia, where the government challenged whether the district court had the authority to hear the case. And so we were arguing that they did. And we're waiting for that opinion. While we wait for that opinion, some things are on pause at the moment. So the immigration case is temporarily on pause while we wait to see what the Third Circuit does. And the district court is holding on discovery, meaning like getting evidence and access to information while we wait to hear from the Third Circuit. So that's where we are right in this moment. Okay. And of course, there's a lot that happened in between. He was caged for 104 days. He missed the birth. He missed the birth of his first baby, Dean, who was born in April. and nor had to give birth without her husband by her side, who had been at every doctor visit and like been such, a critical presence. They are, for those who have now seen them in public together, like they are a unit. And understanding that now on the other side, like recognizing what a loss that was. I mean, not just to be present to the birth of your child, which of course is like an inherently, just so cruel that I can't even conceptualize. And also knowing this particular couple, there's like an added layer of cruelty that I just like, they're so deeply interconnected as people. And anyway, so, so, this whole process has spanned now from March 8th until today and, continues. But with an immense amount of cruelty and harm inflicted in that time.
Yeah. And I appreciate that you also sort of really specified and quantified for us. I mean, he was released after, this is the thing. I think people think, oh, these processes happen and then justice and fairness happens. And it's like, this is for so much labor and pushing and organizing, labor from his lawyers, people being, outright demonstrating, writing. It's a concession that was forced. And this is the thing I think people forget. This is the other part of us focusing on what is it that causes, because if we're in the realm of thinking, oh, it's just the law and it unfolds fairly, none of this shit would happen, right? It's public pressure. It's the immense labor that you all put into this. But I'm also just thinking about, how cruelty is the point. We often say that, right? But I think I really want to highlight that, and because it also brings Gaza and Palestine right into the mix. And the parallel process that I'm seeing between the imperial belly of the beast and the Zionist state, and the ways, it's reminding me of administrative detention, all these sorts of ways that you can sort of wield power. And I think if folks don't know that immigration is also administrative, that we can miss that entirely. But to think also about the through line to the ICE raids we are seeing right now, and that cruelty is the point to make people afraid, to make them not be able to live their lives fully, to have to be afraid to go to the grocery store, to not be able to engage fully in just everyday mundane acts, but also dismemberment. Dismembering families as a way to also stop up flourishing of certain communities and targeting of them and creating targets then. And this is where Marco Rubio comes in for me. Like you were saying, he was revving up from before, and now we see the full extent of it, of course, with these ICE raids and the way he talks about things. And certainly now these extrajudicial killings in Venezuela. All of it ties together in terms of the way that we see the machinery of violence playing together. And I think Mahmoud's case, started again, the contextualizing that you did before feels really important, because then we can understand why the targeting happens in this way, and why targeting a family unit, and why ripping people apart, why going into a building in Chicago and making kids come out into the street naked, and the humiliation that's involved in that, the utter disregard to not just privacy, but sanctity of life, dignity. Humiliation is a part of this. And I'm thinking about all of that as you describe this. So I'm wondering also if you can sort of texturize it for people around some of these maneuvers that are not new in some ways. I'm thinking about Project Boulder, right? But in the context of the history, of course, McCarthyism, everybody says that, but Project Boulder did the same thing around Palestinians and Arabs, and stripping them of their green cards and knocking on their doors and making their neighbors afraid of them. So there's a history there. And also it seems like there's some new shit to be clinical about it, that feels very heightened and very it's almost like a new technology that's being used. And I've heard you in some ways allude to the fact that Mahmoud's case was kind of a test case. And now the proliferation that we're seeing emerges from some of this.
Yeah. There's so much there. I'll start with the end about the new stuff that I think is just really, really critical, which is the access these entities have, these entities of suppression and domination and cruelty and harm and power, and all of these systems and structures wielded like that have such incredible their ability to infiltrate and access has been changed with technology. And so I think a lot of the tools are the same as they've always been, but their ability to wield those tools has changed because of the access that exists now. And also so much has been privatized that if you buy the right people, then you can disappear accounts off of Instagram so that you can't get certain information, or silencing all the people out of Gaza who are trying to show what's happening, and all of that kind of stuff. So I do think technology is one of the ways in which, and it has always been one of the ways in which, this kind of terror and cruelty and harm has been effectuated. But I think the reach is just broader now in ways that we're still fully conceptualizing. Right. And I personally don't. Technology kind of boggles, but as I begin to understand more and more, I find it really alarming. And some of the other things you were saying, it made me think, Nadra Shalhoub Kevorkian has been talking a lot about Ashlet. I don't know.
Yeah, Ashla. Yeah. Ashla.
Yeah, that whole, and she kept, in one of the interviews I heard her, she just, the way, even the tone, and I could feel her throat constricting, like just so passionate about the ways in which this exists at like every layer. So it's not just the body, like an individual body itself being stripped and
dismembered,
right. but the ways communities get pulled, ripped apart, and it's not willing. It's not a willing ripping. It's a forced ripping. And everything you just said is so critical, because being based in the United States on Turtle Island, I'm very mindful of the ways in which some of these same tools that we're seeing now of separation and ripping people apart and uprooting people from community, from culture, it is something we do with expertise and have now exported to Israel, and what's being enacted also, and horribly enacted on Palestinian bodies and communities and humans, human
since
beings.
The inception of this settler colony.
Yes, and so as you were talking, I was thinking about the residential schools. When I was a public defender in Alaska, and the majority of my clients were Native Alaskan, and many of them were either themselves survivors of these residential schools, or were the next generation their parents had. I worked in Oklahoma, and the sovereign nations in Oklahoma, when working with clients, when we would do a family history, they would be 3 or 4 generations deep of family separation, where children had been removed from the home generation after generation after generation. In this country, white supremacy and people who look like me, who uphold these systems and structures of dominance and cruelty, have determined who gets to love, what love looks like, what a family looks like, what a community looks like, what connection to land looks like, and litigates it in the public fora all the time, through family separation, through how we educate, through constant disorientation and disconnection from land, extractive and violent behavior toward the land, toward animals, toward humans. It is in our DNA, collective DNA here, and not by choice. Some who have had that violence enacted upon them. And so it's in their DNA, of survival and resilience and all of that and resistance. And some of us are deprogramming the DNA that we've received on how to separate ourselves from our bodies and remain disconnected from land, from community. And so all of these systems and structures that we're seeing at work with, like separating Mahmoud and Noor for the birth of their first child, or trying to remove Mahmoud from the Colombia community that he had been an organizer within, but also from the United States altogether, so we don't get to hear him.
And from the state to separate from his team, his legal team, when he was actually transferred, right?
Right,
yeah.
Right. And so it's from the micro to the macro.
Yes.
And these fissures and rips and tears are filled with scapegoating and fear by these media folks and politicians, et cetera, to pit so that they can't be woven back together again, but instead everybody gets factioned off and isolated. And so we are dismembered. We do become dismembered from our own bodies. We become, dismembered from each other. Our ability to relate and to be seen together, to hear each other is challenged. And all of that, I mean, we referenced divide and conquer earlier, but divide and conquer is not just like I don't have to tell you this, but it's not just like a physical strategy of I'll put you over here and you over here. It's I'm going to make everything intellectualized and cerebral. I think, therefore I am. Like, I think, therefore I am, which requires some variant of like white rational thought, as opposed to I am because I am. Like, or I'm not sure how to articulate that exactly, but like from that sort of intrapersonal level, all the way out to relational fabrics. And the idea is that if we are all isolated from each other and scared of each other, then it makes it easier to enact carceral systems. It's easier to cage people. It's easier to execute people. And just, and I think, as a human being who has traveled to the occupied West Bank, I couldn't get into Gaza. I tried to go there too, but and who's seen 48, who has seen the wall, who's seen the checkpoints. Not that I needed to see to believe. I did believe prior, but I literally.
But there's nothing quite like it.
Yeah.
There's nothing quite like experiencing it and seeing how big that fucking wall is.
Right. And what I'm it's a little scary to test this out on a podcast, but I'm going to say the damage inflicted on Turtle Island in the United States was so profound initially that there wasn't even the time to build the walls. Thinking about smallpox and the eradication of the buffalo and like sustenance, the eradication of land. And people resisted in the United States. People banded together, indentured servants and enslaved people and indigenous people collaborated and were trying to like disrupt these systems. But the force came so quickly and strong. And then the walls never got erected per se, but they are absolutely in place in how, and I suppose you could argue the prison walls and these residential school
different
walls
instantiations. That's right.
Yeah, but I don't want to say they're the same, because that in a way I think sometimes that strips away the power and rupture that what exists in Palestine is. And also, I think that's also part of the technological advancements in part. But I see these things operating in such similar ways, which is why, I think we saw such powerful, why we've always seen such powerful solidarity from South Africa to Palestine to Ferguson and indigenous peoples in the United States, Black Panthers, et cetera, Young Lords, who all viewed it, these sort of structures and systems as familial.
Yes.
They're all in the same family, different iterations potentially.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think, in the ways in which this was enacted on Mahmoud, I think about the bureaucratic violence of his arrest. He wasn't tackled to the ground. He wasn't tasered. But the violence of the quietness of the rupture.
The calculated nature of it.
It's still like, even as I have like a bubble in my chest that I get when I talk about it. I don't, it's like an air, like the quietness has always disturbed me. Not that I would ever want him to have been brutalized,
Sure.
But the power of that rupture, and you can hear the terror in Noor's voice, and and yet it was so staid. There was a
It was almost mundane.
Yeah, mundane.
Yeah.
It was mundane violence, right?
Yeah.
And if that can happen and the whole world didn't shut down, then you can start escalating. So then you have Rumesa's kidnapping, right?
Yeah.
Where she was surrounded by masked men on a road and she was screaming. And she also wasn't brutalized in the sense of like thrown to the ground and whatever, but holy shit, was that just that was incredibly violent thing to bear witness to. And people did organize, people did speak. I want to give props for their due.
Yes.
And also the world didn't shut down. So then now you can start walking around neighborhoods and clotheslining people off of bicycles and ramming into cars and pulling people off of roofs who are like,
and having bounty hunters who
right. Privatize it. You can privatize it and whatever. And the thing is, like, I said this very, very early on, when Mahmoud was first taken, and I was still trying to process and articulate, but we collectively as a society, these tactics are always tested on people who, those of us like me with a lot of social and political, financial, racial capital. Will I put my capital on the line to speak,
to
right?
Expend it.
To expend it, right? And so these systems and structures are savvy enough to know that if they quietly start with the people that are just enough controversial or don't look enough like me or have a name like Mahmoud or, are have black skin or, are whatever, like any way to differentiate that person from the people with that capital. If we start sliding those people away, those folks who can make these fissures and disruptions further up the line, who are engaged in purchasing items, who are engaged in, like, our dock workers are, literally have the material capacity to stop these things from physically going anywhere, whatever, but if I look at Mahmoud or I look at Manuel or I look at, Mamadou Tall, who ended up choosing, and I don't see myself in them, I may not expend any of those capitals that I have. And so it escalates. And I think that that's a very real thing. And I was just saying to a friend of mine the other day, that is why, and I know people have different feelings about Dr. King, but I will just say that the letter, Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, was about the expenditure of those types of capital. It was two moderate whites who were remaining silent in the face of the brutalization of Black people in the South, trying to vote, trying to live their lives, trying to earn equal wages, trying to ride the bus, trying to, stay alive, not be lynched. Like, but where are you? You're not expending any of your capital right now. Where are you? Right. And I think with Mahmoud, with so many others, I can't express to you how many people stuck their head in the sand, or they would very privately reach out and say, thank you so much for taking this case or pushing this forward.
That private shit is always the way it goes.
Yes. And so, so there's so many
Yeah.
layers to this,
Yes.
because that also takes it down to the individual. And the fact of the matter is that these systems and structures have always been set up to separate,
That's
have
right.
always been set up to value some lives over other lives, have always been set up to name who has access to privacy, what privacy is, who can love and what that love should or should not look like. I mean, hell, we had laws that said that people can't love each other, like they can't be partnered with each other. And so, I mean, none of this is shocking to anybody, but when you start really looking at this from all of these different facets, from the intrapersonal, what lives in me, out to the interpersonal, to broader interdependency, and the ways in which we've always experienced these massive fissures and this massive removal of people from our communities, and walked around with these gaping wounds in their absence, and not necessarily. And many communities have worked so very hard to tend to those wounds and nurture community despite that wounding. But so many others have been forced to simply just go on and survive.
Right.
And not be able to tend to those gaping wounds of the absences of fathers, the absences of family members, of
because they were stolen.
Right.
Because they were stolen from them.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other thing I'll just say, that the last thing I'll say is, we talk about, I have said this so many times, like Mahmoud was not charged with a crime, has never been charged of a crime, accused of a crime even, did not engage in criminal behavior, was speaking for Palestinian life and dignity and speaking against a genocide being perpetrated by Israel and with U.S. complicity and support. And the term to use for the 104 days is civil detention. And there's nothing civil about detention ever. And also, like, I'm really mindful of this myself. It's like, we've got to collectively be aware of the language. Like, he was caged for 104 days. He was ripped from his community and from his wife. He was deprived of the life-giving opportunity to be present for the birth of his child. And he was in a dormitory with, I think he said, over 70 other men who were missing their wives' cancer treatments, missing their children's birthdays, who were terrified to return back to where they had come here, because they had fled for their lives. And each and every one of those individuals is a universe in and of themselves, who that universe has a gaping wound. Right. And while that person is being caged for reasons, that they don't even know in some cases. And so, this fracturing is very real and so intentional. And because it's so persistent, like for a bone to heal or a wound to heal, it has to be tended to and let, with a poultice or a wrap or a support, and it needs rest. It needs a chance to knit itself back together. But when the fracturing and the fracturing and the fracturing and the fracturing, it just keeps coming, there's no chance ever for that repair to occur. And so, anyone who is open-hearted in this moment is walking around with those wounds. And then, of course, some people more directly, in the sense that it is their loved one who has been stolen. But for any of us paying attention, we live and walk with all of that as well.
As we should, right? I've said that before, is like the prescription to have this sear us and hold it so that we're not conscripted or seduced into that dissociation, that dismemberment out of it, to be able to keep our finger on the pulse of what the condition is that created the possibility for this to happen, the context of it, the history of it, like you're laying out, right? This settler colony, it's not by chance that this settler colony that's founded on genocide of indigenous peoples sees itself in the other settler colony that is doing the same thing and pats it on the back and says, good job. This is precisely in our image. Right. And one of the things I think you're saying, and we can move to sort of wrap up, I have a question for you around that, but the precision of language is actually really important. I kind of really want to go through this with a fine-tuned comb. I think sometimes we are made to feel or are told that repeating these things or saying them or being precise is being pedantic, that we are sort of saying the obvious, or it's kind of like what I said before, but there's nothing, there are no platitudes in the face of this violence. And I think repeating these issues about where, you know, where the structure, how the structure came to be as it is, for me, antagonizes the ability of these things to settle inside of us and in our world as normative fixtures. So if we go back to Palestine and settler colonialism, or in the context of settler colonialism here, is the whole point is that you up the ante slowly, right? Now I've heard from people on the ground in Palestine, in the so-called West Bank, that there are 3,000 checkpoints now. And this is after the genocide in Gaza started. Now there's 3,000. There's
a very
gate
small space.
Exactly. There's a gate that gets locked and opened every single day. There is no, you know, exit and entry without that. That it didn't start like that. But the whole point psychologically is you up the ante of what is acceptable and what's normative to the point that it's meant to hide in plain sight. It's meant to become part of the topography, materially, geographically, but then also in our interiority as well. So this repetition, the sort of naming of it, the localizing it, historicizing it, going back and walking through the mechanics of how it can come to be in this moment. You know, on March 8th, how did this happen? There's an entire history that leads up to this moment, is really important. The other thing that I'll say is that one of the things I really appreciate about Mahmoud's framing of being a political prisoner, but also just every time he spoke about his case, he didn't forget the people that were with him, right? And I think that's somebody who's also clued into a movement. He was part of a movement that was actually looking at these things in seriousness and studying the way that systems work and studying carcerality. But that's also, I think, what you're bringing in for us is how do we keep in sight and at the top of our minds that this might be a success, that Mahmoud was released on June 20th because of the labor that was put into it. And also all the people on the daily who are being kidnapped, abducted, their families are being forced to experience this, the history of indigenous folks in this settler colony that relive this every single day, that are disappeared, that people think they no longer exist. From the daily indignities to these larger sort of spectacles that we see, that for me, it just, again, tells me, number one, who are the targets that are being constructed by this as a means to say, to bring liberals in. Liberals love joining fascists around these sorts of things when they think that they are getting rid of dangerous people. And I think that's the wrap-up piece that I'd like us to kind of end on is, I heard in one of your talks that you said, somebody had asked you, what can we do? And you said, I'm paraphrasing here, but you said, resist believing that Mahmoud is the person that people paint him out to be. And in my mind, it was like the terrorist, the dangerous person, which extends to everybody being kidnapped and abducted by ICE, to the people who are being extrajudicially executed, you know, beyond the borders of the United States, in the genocide. It feels like it ties into a lot about the ways that we psychically resist joining in the project to make these specters of violence settle inside of us, as though those are the people we should be worried about, rather than the motherfuckers who are sending people to abduct people.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that gets to the heart of the matter. And I one of the things, this is, I as I'm listening to you, I'm like, my gut and my heart are both like, yes. And then I'm like, okay, language. But you know, one of the things, like, I used to teach high school students, earning college credit, which was great because I didn't have the confines of the high school classroom. I could teach them like a professor, which was great. And one of the things we talked about, and it was a community organizing and class, and one of the things we talked about is precisely naming something. And to me, to say name means to situate, contextualize, historicize, you know, all of those pieces. A naming carries with it, you know, just like, you know, parents may choose your name, there, it comes all kinds of components. Similarly, when we call a spade, as they say, like that word carries something in it. And it's very, very hard to challenge something or to say you want something different or to build something different if you don't understand the thing that, if you haven't named and understood the thing in front of you. And I think that, so the precision of language is something that I personally have struggled with, in the sense of like, there's so much that gets normalized that sometimes I even catch myself using like an idiom or something that's like, incredibly violent, or, and I hear the words coming out of my mouth and I'm like, whoa, okay, hold on a second. But I think it's so critical that we do slow down and get precise, because the more we hear our own selves, the poet David Whyte talks about overhearing yourself well. The more we hear that language coming out of our own mouths, and then other people hear it and we all start to hear it, the more it disrupts that normalizing, I think, which is your point, and or part of your incredible point. Yeah. And I, again, not to mention Dr. King again, but he always talks about that the world will be saved by the creatively maladjusted. And I think that was partially what he was referring to, is that idea that language language helps normalize. And the other thing that I'll note is, I don't know how many times you've driven around here in the United States, or your listeners have driven here, Turtle Island in the United States, the settler colony of United States, and driven by a high school and then seen a jail right next to it. Mm-hmm. Or that you're out in the middle of a rural part of the country, and you're driving around and you might see cotton fields or cornfields or whatever, and then you see a massive prison complex where it's out of sight. Like you might have to be driving on these back roads or whatever, and yet the jails are so visible, particularly in urban areas. They're like, you drive past, like I might drive past it going to the farmer's market. In fact, I do. The Baltimore City Jail, I drive by it to go to the farmer's market. And I pointed it out to a friend of mine the other day, and she's like, oh my God, I've lived here 20 years. I've never noticed that before. Yeah. And she's a caring, loving, beautiful person.
That's right. That's the point.
But that's the point, is when we leave things unnamed, or they shapeshift regularly, so it's hard to name them and wrap your arms around them, they can continue to proceed because nobody knows how to talk about them, or they're afraid to talk about them, or they're too privileged to even notice in the first place. So any and all of that combination is possible. And then you start placing these carceral and very brutal things right next to allegedly innocuous things like a school, but then you get closer to the school and you realize there are metal detectors to get into the school right next to the jail. And then there's police cars sitting outside the school, and you're wondering, is that car there for the school or for the jail? And you're not quite sure. And all of that starts getting normalized. And so one of the things that I also heard in between the lines that I think is so critical of your question, that I'm not sure I'm fully answering, is when things go unnoticed, unnamed, and not on repeat, like where we naming and noticing on repeat, and we normalize and let all of that live within us, our capacity for imagination and vision is deeply depressed.
It's foreclosed.
It's foreclosed. And I have to believe that part of the way that we can survive where we drive past a jail to go to school or to go to the farmer's market or to go about our daily life is that in order to drive by that and be unaffected, a part of me has to shut down. Or it never opened up in the first place, depending on how a body is situated. And so if we live from the neck up, and we to bring us full circle, to intellectualize everything, and naming to me is a physiological experience, truly naming, using the precise language is an embodied endeavor, because you are choosing to notice. You are literally turning your head to notice. And you are naming that as for example, the carceral space that you are driving by as you go about your daily business. And you're noticing that there are hundreds of bodies potentially in a cage.
Yeah.
And so then you have to live in your body differently and engage in the world differently in order to hold that.
Yeah.
And then imagine what it might be like to not
Yes.
have that.
Yes.
And I think so many of us have to shut down. And I say this with the utmost respect of how hard it is to be alive right now. And like the fact that like even like arguing with your health insurance company, if you have the privilege of having health insurance, to get something covered could take 20 hours of your week.
Yes. Yes.
And that 20 hours is not spent on liberation. That 20 hours is spent on getting your friggin' colonoscopy covered as, you know, preventive and not diagnostic, you know, like that kind of recent
Talk about
experience.
mundane shit.
Yes.
Literally.
Right. Literally. Right. And so all of that is just to say that when in order to survive in so many of these situations, we have to close down in order to function. And I have empathy for that, truly. And also, the more that we do that and we close ourselves down like that, the more we also prevent and foreclose our imaginal capacity, our liminal capacity to live in gray spaces, to live in spaces where we can be present to each other, where we can hold each other, where we can share our grief together, where we can activate together, where we can choose something different. And I think language has a huge part of that, because when we are in a Western culture where a lot of people have adopted this cerebral, intellectualized, I think, therefore I am space, vocabulary and feeling words coming out of our mouths, like caging as opposed to civil detention.
Yes.
It opens and unlocks a different physiological experience that then starts our own little cracks and fissures where we re-enter our bodies and realize that how we've been is not sustainable in any kind of humane way, in any kind of liberatory way, in any kind of loving way, whole way, thriving way, life-sustaining way, you know. And so I don't know if I answered your question, but that's how I sit with all of that. And I am imperfect in it every single day. In this interview, I've been imperfect in it. And also recognize that it's going to take all of us with that precision and with those efforts to be brave in our speech, to then open up new pockets of our body and open up new imaginal spaces. That's the only way that we move into any kind of life-sustaining society.
Yeah. And the certainty of our liberation.
Yeah.
What a beautiful way to end. Thank you so much, Amy. Is there anything else you would love to leave folks with or say, or that we haven't gone to? I mean, this has been delightful, and I so appreciate you for coming on board so early on.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. Thank you for creating the space. I think the last thing that I really need to say, we need courage now. And we need to the extent that we are able, and to the extent, or, you know, it feels different in literally every body, but we need to tap into something, like root into the earth and remember ourselves, so that remember ourselves, not dismember ourselves, to go back to the ashla and that kind of, and we need courage now. And silence is not an option, and silence will not save us. And so I think the invitation needs to stand, like, come join, talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends, talk to your family, your maid family or your blood family, and build community now, and have courage to love and be vulnerable now, and stand together now, because I'm still seeing an awful lot of isolation and separation, and I have empathy and sympathy for the fear, but courage is needed now. And and I hope that people will join you in your courage and your incredible spaces that you're creating, as an invitation to stand tall and proud in that courage
and disrupt the violence. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah.
I so
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.